Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll probably have more folks trickling in as we go along. Thanks again for joining us for Beyond the Build, standing for racial equity. My name is Luanda Arai. I'm the program manager at sea.citi. And for those of you who don't know sea.citi, we are how tech and the community collaborate for results. We work with tech companies and with tech workers, and we are focused on ensuring that our region continues to thrive. And that tech workers can connect in a meaningful way to the community and on civic issues. This is the second event in our Beyond the Build series. The series is really focused on shining a light between how tech companies and the public and nonprofit sectors collaborate. And we know that these strengths can be complementary and then accelerate the path to livable, sustainable, and equitable communities. And so today we're really talking about how tech is taking real action towards racial equity. Um, like I said, we are using the Q&A function for you to submit your questions. Feel free to do that as we go along. Keep an eye on the chat for any relevant links throughout the discussion. We'll send out some follow-up materials and further rating and resources after, as well as a recording of the event. So just so you know that. And then before we really get underway with our wonderful speakers, I wanted to set the stage a little bit with some common language. So generally speaking, tech companies, the work that tech companies do around racial equity falls under the umbrella of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I wanted to do some level setting around what do we mean by those words, and just make some assertions about how we're approaching this conversation. So we come to this conversation with the understanding that structural and institutional racism are real and that everyone has unconscious biases. We also know that no one person or entity has racial equity completely figured out, and we're all at different stages of this journey, and that's okay, and we want to learn from each other and move in the same direction. And so because we use this DEI framing, we have this little visual up on the screen now that I wanted to sort of break down a little bit to level set for the conversation. So this DEI, or your company might use different letters or those letters in a different different order. We feel that it's helpful in advancing the racial equity conversation when they're interconnected and cross-cutting. And so we're focusing specifically on racial equity because even though there are many ways that systemic discrimination shows up, race is always a compounding factor. So for example, if we're talking about barriers for people with differing abilities, there's abundant data to show that those barriers are exacerbated for Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have differing abilities. And we could parse out many other different types of discrimination and how race compounds the barriers that folks face. So we also will add a DEI glossary to the chat. So if there are uncommon terms as the conversation goes along, you'll find those there. Might be a good resource for continuing this conversation after the event. And so, many companies have publicly declared racial equity goals, and our speakers are really going to shed light on how their companies are having real impact and moving beyond making those statements. sea.citi is made up of several different member companies, and we are really excited to highlight the wonderful work that Remitly and Tableau are doing. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Stephen Wee. He's our moderator for today. Stephen is the head of public policy for the Northwest region at Facebook. Before that, he worked for the governor's office as the primary liaison to King County, overseeing efforts on diversity outreach. His background includes community outreach and refugee policy. He serves on sea.citi's board. He's our vice president. He's also on the board of the Bellevue Chamber and One Redmond. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for moderating for us today.
Thank you so much, Wanda. I'm so excited to be here. As Wanda mentioned, I also serve as a vice chair of the board here at sea.cities, and I want to thank all of you actually for taking time today to be a part of this webinar. It's beautiful outside. I know how rare it is to have these sunny days, so I appreciate your sort of interest in what we're talking about this afternoon. So as Wanda mentioned, we'll be joined by two amazing individuals actually who are working on these issues on the ground, grassroots level, with various community-based organizations, as well as their multinational companies that they are a part of. We've got Neal Myrick. He's the Vice President of Social Impact at Tableau and the global head of the Tableau Foundation, where he leads the company's global impact initiatives focused on encouraging the use of facts and analytical reasoning to solve world problems. Neal's an active angel investor and has served as a volunteer nonprofit board member and philanthropist. He's a member of the governing board of Digital Square, a global health technology initiative, and on the data roundtable for the Global Partnership for Education. Welcome, Neal. Thank you. Also, we've got Kim Vu. Kim is the global head of diversity and equity and inclusion at Remitly, a fintech company serving over 2 million immigrants throughout the world. She has been in the banking executive for about 20 years now. She's all about building new businesses, verticals, and scaling the social impact of financial institutions and fintech companies. Outside of work, Kim serves on the boards of the Crisis Text Line and the Respect Institute, and is an advisor to Included, a DEI startup tech. She's been featured on Yahoo Finance, the Financial Times, GeekWire, Seattle Business Magazine, and Silicon Valley Business Journal for her numerous contributions to community championing diversity in business. So welcome, Kim. So we're going to start out. I'm going to kind of flip it up a little bit. I know we kind of dive into the questions and all that, but I wanted to kind of get a sense of how are you guys doing? This has been a crazy year. Oh my gosh, I don't know about you guys, but like I feel so strange talking through a box all day and through a webcam. So, want to get a feeling of how you doing, how you're holding in. I mean, I'll be honest, I live alone. My plants are my friends and my kids. And so for me, I discovered a love for like plants. So Kim, how are you doing? How are things going with you?
Yeah, like you said, it's been quite a year. And so it's always like, I feel like to answer that question, it changes hour by hour is what it feels like over the course of the last year. It's been all of the feelings all at the same time. But I think in the present moment today, I'm feeling overall a sense of appreciation for the communities that is around me that has really been able to support me while also being able to be a space where I can support outside of my job and my role to really be able to provide impact where I feel like Kim as an individual can also do, which I think has been really important for a lot of people to feel like they could do over the course of this last year. I mean, you could really kind of take your pick of where you wanted to really contribute. And so really appreciative of community and partnerships, especially over this last year.
That's awesome. Neal, how about you? How are you doing? How's everything?
Thank you, Steve. Just echoing what Kim said, it's simultaneously great and weird and frustrating and at times. It's really great because I think a lot of us in the tech community have been able to really step up our budgets and our work in the community to help nonprofit organizations through the last year. And I'm just unbelievably grateful to have that opportunity to do that kind of work. And then I'm ready to get back in the office. I'm not ready to commute, but it's every day of the week, but I'm ready to go back like 2-3 days, hang with my team, see people in the company. I'm one of those people that I fixed a corner of my garage to look nicer than a garage, but I'm kind of sick to death of being alone in my garage.
Oh no, we should join you in that garage then. Oh my gosh.
There you go, exactly.
Well, hey, speaking of going back to work, let's start with you, Neal. Tell us a little bit more about Tableau. I know people who use Tableau absolutely love it. Can you kind of give us a quick overview for folks who may not be familiar with Tableau, overview of the company?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll start with the fact that Tableau is now part of Salesforce. And the Salesforce Customer 360 platform is the #1 digital platform for connecting to customers in the world. We're the analytics portion, and you can think about Tableau as an analytics platform. And what I mean by that is we take all the data that everybody collects and can combine it together and help you create really compelling visual tools and dashboards to help people see and understand those data. And then my role in Tableau is to run the foundation. And so we help nonprofit organizations use Tableau to help them see and understand their data so they can accelerate and transform their mission. So super happy to be here.
Awesome. Now, Kim, tell us more about Remitly. I think some folks are familiar with Remitly, but I think some folks may think, what do you guys do? So tell us more.
Yeah, absolutely. More than happy to share a little bit about what Remitly is about. So we were started with the purpose to really be able to create more access, inclusion, and equity in traditional financial systems where our customers, many of whom are immigrants, have been historically left out of financial systems in this way. And so as a remittance company, we're really focused on ensuring that our customers have the peace of mind of knowing that they have a safe and affordable and efficient way to be able to send money home to their families. And this has been something that also has just been personally really near and dear to my heart in terms of the mission of our work, because as someone who has family members who are customers of remittances and growing up and having to have the experience of going to physical remittance locations to be able to send money home to our family, knowing how important that is to be able to make sure that it gets there on time, that it gets there, like the dollars that we send, as much of those dollars that we send don't get eaten up by fees and actually get to our families is so incredibly important. And so the work that we do every day to make it easy, to make it fast, to make it secure and reliable is really critical and top of mind for everybody who works at Remitly.
That's awesome. Good, good, good. Now, Kim, I'm going to focus on you real quick. So Remitly, you guys have seen some tremendous growth over the past several years. Can you kind of tell a bit more about what Remitly has learned about the importance of DEI, with the work that you're doing during this growth? And also, what kind of insights have Remitly employees learned about basically the immigrant experience, the sort of remittance ecosystem, and how does that manifest it for you?
Yeah, I'll answer that in two parts. First, just around like what have we learned, and then two, how do we actually help our employees learn about the customer experience as well. And in terms of what we've learned over the course of the last few years, and more specifically over this last year of having experienced a lot of growth during a very abnormal time where everybody was working in very just strange environments, under new experiences of lots of different stresses and pressures that were happening at home, in our communities, in society around the globe. There was a lot of things that we learned in terms of what worked well and what we were able to accelerate because of everything that was happening outside of in the world. And that one of the things that I think was really helpful for us that we were able to really lean in on during the course of this last year is our DEI work actually started well before kind of COVID and everything started, in that we had started thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion several years ago, really thinking about how do we improve the diversity of our workforce and really starting to invest in partnerships that created space for us to be able to diversify our workforce with early relationships with organizations like Ada Academy and Code 2040. But even then, at that point, with that, in addition to a rise of employee engagement within our organizations around the building of affinity groups, we also started to recognize and realize, hey, we're a growing organization. We're starting to have a much larger footprint within the global sphere. It's time for us to bring in a leader to be able to kind of lead this work more intentionally and really think about it as we grow. And that was the opportunity for me to join the organization back in August of 2019. And so as I was joining, we started to build a lot of structure and routines that really helped us start to create spaces for us to be able to talk to one another, have curious conversations, to really understand one another and learn from each other. Those practices and routines that were already well built into place, when our environment started to both physically shift and then also shift socially around us, those routines and practices and frameworks that we had in place became and what held us up and propped us up through that process, right? Because we had routines in place already to be able to hold space for people to process what was happening in their worlds and in our, our larger collective world. That really helped us have that to be able to respond rather than react to what was happening around us, which I think was incredibly powerful. And then when thinking about what did we learn through this process in this last year about the customer experience and the immigrant communities that we serve, I think COVID impacted everyone, right? But COVID really did especially impact our customer base, because many of our customers who are immigrants, who predominantly are frontline workers, right? Who had to be the ones that tend to be the most exposed to the potential of COVID, to the potential of either job loss or the impact to their income, to not being able to get home to their families. So for instance, our customers who are seafarers, if you had followed the headlines, a lot of seafarers were stuck on ships and unable to dock back in their home countries to be home safe with their families, right? And so there was a lot of different issues that came up that we learned about through our customers' experience this last year, and the challenges beyond the everyday challenges of being an immigrant, right? And then you add in just the rise of socio and racial tensions, not just here in the US, but globally, right? And so there was anti-immigration, like a lot of anti-immigration, actions that were happening during the course of, the last several years, anti-Black, racism and violence that was happening that also impacted a number of our customers as well. And then of course, more recently with the rise and visibility of anti-Asian violence that is also occurring. So like when we think about what's happening in our community and really understanding what's happening for our customers and our employees, we're really kind of thinking about those things. And then also because we are a global organization, there was a lot of, just pandemic, and then just like the occurrence of natural disasters that are happening in a lot of countries in the global South where our customers are from. So being able to balance that and respond and react and to support everybody has been just huge learnings in terms of how do we become better effective at what we do in terms of response, and how do we make sure that our products are readily accessible, and where it makes sense, if we need to speed up the process of being able to send funds and remove barriers of fees and things like that, we make those decisions fairly quickly to be able to respond.
Oh my gosh, I see so many different systems here coming together and merging. It's like there's so much to unpack there, but amazing work, amazing work. Neal, let's go to you next. So Tableau seen some significant growth and a lot of transition in the past year or two with acquisition by Salesforce. Can you talk about a little bit more about how DEI approaches were or were not aligned, and how executives navigated the merger from a DEI perspective? And then also personally, how has it sort of impacted the way that you've managed your team and approached all of this?
Yeah, great question. I think what was exciting to all of us, about the Salesforce transaction, the acquisition, was that the values of our two companies were really closely aligned. And so when you look at what both of our companies had been doing, there was so much similarity that and not a lot of real conflict or disagreement there. And since we've been acquired and been integrated, Tableau falls directly under a set of goals that Salesforce has made globally and publicly for achieving DE&I goals. You can go to equality.com and it gives the latest numbers. And the thing that I appreciate most really is that as a company and other companies have done this, we set a set of goals, we're transparent about what those goals are, we're transparent about where we are relative to those goals. And then we use the experience and everything that we learned through the process of trying to achieve those goals to help educate the broader community around what we're finding works and doesn't work. And so it's really been, I think, a very seamless process in many ways. As all of us know who've been working in the tech sector for a long time. You know, DE&I goals have been part of our discussion for probably 30 years. And I'm grateful that I feel like in many cases, you know, we've reached a point where we just can't keep talking about it for another 30 years. And we have to like put our feet down and get some real work done. And it's not easy. There's lots of challenges from all over the place, but, you know, I think transparency and accountability are really one strong step toward making sure that this time around, after 30 years of commitments of companies, this time around, I feel like we're making a lot more progress because of the transparency and accountability that companies like Salesforce are supporting.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You know, this whole subject itself, it's not easy, right? It's not pretty, it's not neat. You know, there can be some difficult situations. And I think you hit the nail on the head as well. You know, it'll take time, right? These are issues that have been around for a very long time, right? They're institutional issues as well, but we have a role of continuing to build on those foundations. We may not see the fruits of our labor tomorrow or the week after, but know that we're still continuing to fight and build upon each other and our endeavors. So no, I think that's great. This question is for both of you, and maybe I'll go have you answer this first. And you know, but in general, what is your company's sort of overarching approach to DEI? Right, I know both Remitly and Tableau are global companies. How does the DEI approach get adapted to sort of the regions that you're operating in right now?
Great question. We start by setting the global goals. So for example, one of our goals is 50% of, we're starting with the US here, 50% of our US workforce will be made up of underrepresented groups by 2023. So we are pursuing those goals. And then under kind of the broader umbrella, you know, it's important that the goals get set in a way that respects the communities and cultures that we're working in. And so those get set sort of independently in many ways around the culture of wherever we happen to have a particular office. But then they roll up under a set of metrics that the entire organization is able to measure themselves against. And as we all know, you know, racism in America is different than racism in other countries. And so we can't necessarily paint all racism with the same brush. And then underrepresented groups in other countries are often underrepresented for all kinds of reasons, not just race and ethnicity. And so it's a very complex set of issues to deal with. And then my team focuses largely, we have a team of people that focus internally on the DE&I sort of efforts inside the company. And then my team, we focus externally. And so in use philanthropy and donating products and training and financial support. And what we're trying to do is address some of the systemic issues that sort of lead to the many challenges that then, you know, are reflected partly in sort of what we experience internally through our DE&I efforts. So for example, our racial justice data initiative that we launched last year in July, that's focused on fighting anti-Black racism in the US. And as we've listened to our Black employees and Black community members, interviewed dozens of nonprofits, one of the things that we've learned is that if we don't address anti-Black racism in the South, it's going to be difficult to address it sort of more broadly in the US. And so a lot of our philanthropy efforts right now are focusing on the South. So as you mentioned, you know, these issues that we're addressing are very complex. They take a long time to solve. The luxury my team has is we have the luxury of actually looking out over the long term. So 3 years, 5 years, 10 years versus the quarterly cadence that, you know, companies normally have to operate on here in the US. And so we're grateful to have that sort of perspective and be able to really focus on the systemic changes that are needed to not just deal with the DE&I challenges within companies, but kind of racism more broadly.
Now, I'm going to double click on that real quick. COVID overall, has that
Yeah.
changed that in any way? And has that sort of made you look at things a little differently? I know you guys did a great job in funding some of the Seattle school stuff, right? But like there's that digital equity thing that popped up that no one really paid much attention to. And all of a sudden COVID happened, nonprofits and schools had to go from 0 to 100 overnight, right? And so curious, how has the COVID pandemic sort of shifted some of that thinking and some of that approach too?
Good question. Two things happened during COVID. One is, as you pointed out, it exposed these issues that have been lingering for a long time, right? So the digital divide among students, we've all known that that's existed for a long time.
Yeah.
I know Kim did some really great work at B of A around like STEM education and some work like that. What COVID did was two things. One is it just made it made the problem more real to more people. And we're actually working on a number of projects right now where we're trying to pull data and describe the digital divide disaggregated by race, so we can actually see across the US, who has access, who doesn't have access, and to help really guide decision making around where resources can be put to address the issue. So one thing I think the pandemic did, it made the issue real for a larger number of people than would have ever thought about it before the pandemic. Now we have to have these tools to help us understand how big is the problem, where is the problem, and how do we prioritize resources to actually solve the problem. So I'm excited about that stream of work. The other thing the pandemic taught us that is reflected in our racial justice work now is Tableau Foundation, our grants have always been unrestricted. We've always had an easy grant process up front, so not to overburden the nonprofit grant process. Our funding is unrestricted. We have very low reporting requirements. We really tried to lower that foundation burden that nonprofits often have to feel. What we saw during the pandemic is a lot of foundations, Ford Foundation was a big leader in this. A lot of foundations changed how they did philanthropy in order to get money out the door quickly, lower the burden for nonprofits, really help them survive the pandemic. So we're hoping that sticks in the broader philanthropic community. And as we move into looking at racial justice, a lot of the organizations that we have to work with at the community level, especially those led by people of color, have long been underfunded, almost never get multi-year grants, almost never get unrestricted grants. And that's really held them back from achieving their full potential. And so we're hoping that the lessons of the pandemic, making money, funding more easily accessible, easier to manage and administrate, and easier to get, is going to really help as we try to, invest our resources now in fighting anti-Black racism and other issues.
That's awesome.
So I'm actually excited about the lessons learned that hopefully will stick.
I love the term disaggregate data. And so you does music to my ears, right? You always have to, anyways.
Yeah.
Kim, on to you, my dear. So in general, what is your company's overarching approach to DEI? And same question as well, how has COVID, changed that or changed direction or given you different lens to look at things, basically?
Yeah, in terms of our overarching approach to DEI, so we have our first principles around what inclusion and belonging looks like at our organization, really centering our mission of our organization around the customer and immigrant community experience, and really also at the same time kind of holding in that space, recognizing that local cultures and communities may not share the same values and practices and policies that we do in the US. And so what we're really explicit about is what that first principle is for us around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really acknowledging that the way people think and operate, present, and process is in the forefront of being really curious and empathetic about different people's lived experiences and identities, while also being really mindful and working really closely with our local teams around understanding what it means to have an inclusive and safe work environment for everybody to do their best work. And some of those examples might look like, for instance, when we're working really closely with our LGBTQIA teammates and the affinity groups that are located in various locations around the globe, where there's a very clear and explicit message that this is a safe space, right? This is a safe environment for you to be out at work and to be able to do your best work here. And recognize that there are countries that we also operate in where that may not necessarily be the case, where it is safe for you to do so outside the confines of our building, right? And so we would never expect anybody to like perform or operate outside of the confines of what is considered safe in their local environment, right? But they know that as an individual, and their teammates also know that if they choose to be out in the workplace, that Remitly as an organization, when they're in our space, that is a safe space. So that just kind of gives like examples of how we vary around that, because that matters, right? Because we're literally talking about this, the physical safety of the lives of our employees. So we want to be really mindful of that. In terms of thinking around like how COVID really changed the way we really think about the dynamics of diversity, equity, and inclusion across our different locations. I mean, it really goes back to some of the things that I mentioned earlier about how does this impact specific communities, and therefore how do we then pivot to ensure that not only is the work that we're doing with our customers, but also with our employees in terms of like very quickly ramping them up and informing and educating them and creating and providing the tools and resources to make it available so that they can also engage very quickly as well. And so one of the things that we started to prop up relatively quickly were example like employee action guides, where very quickly we would ramp up a template where it would have, here are the places that we've vetted that are the best organizations at the local level, the national level, and the global level to contribute to. And then we would provide matching funds to employees to be able to contribute to those organizations directly. And then we would look at, here are organizations that you can do virtual volunteering with, and or places where you can safely volunteer in person, you know, just kind of based on what your comfort level is. Then third was a piece that we find has been also really powerful with our employee base is, how do we use our voice, right? Not only as a company, but encouraging our employees to get civically engaged, right? And so last year, for example, on Juneteenth, the entire company took the day off and did day-long workshops on, here's how you engage with elected officials. Here's how you attend a city hall meeting, right? Here's how, yeah, advocacy 101.
Yeah, advocacy,
yeah.
sorry.
And so our employees got a chance to really understand, like, here's what it looks like to find like a petition and be able to promote it to your social networks. And so we were really encouraging employees to also think about like the power of your voice and what that really means, and how important, as we all know, like the power of voice within collective movements as well, right? And so really encouraging and empowering our employees to fully like lean into that and use those and use their voice to really create change as well, in addition to the other kind of modalities that they can engage in. And then of course, like the tried and true that we've continued to be able to provide those spaces for continued learning. And that would also be kind of packaged into those employee action guides, in addition to be able to have kind of more routine content that's being delivered to them on a weekly basis through a tool we call Crescendo. That provides global content that really helps our employees engage in the experiences of teammates in different locations. So we created specific learning streams so that teammates could learn about the different lived experiences of teammates living in different locations. And then worked with Crescendo, also building out streams specifically around specific experiences that certain communities are having as a result of COVID.
That is amazing.
And Stephen, could I join if I weigh in there real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
I love the way Kim talks about this, and you know what, when you have the global company and you're trying to deal with such a complex set of issues, I think the role of voice is really important, and the work has to be anchored on a core set of values that the entire global company buys into, and that leadership is promoting, and actively promoting sort of every day. And then Kim, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when the company can have a voice, so even in those countries where as Kim talked about, the LGBTQI is not, it's not safe to be out. The company can still have a voice, but the way that you work with the employees is different there than it would be in other places. And then everywhere in the world, you can really express the values and the voice of the employees through all the activities that Kim went through. So the grant making and the matching grants and the volunteering, and that really amplifies the power of the company when you help your employees engage and activate in their local communities. And then they're the ones who know how to do that in a way that fits within the cultural context of wherever the office happens to be. So it's really Kim did a great job of kind of explaining how all that fits together.
That's awesome. Kim, I want to double click on something again real quick. So, you guys are a global company, you have a diverse workforce. Can you kind of delve deeper about how your DEI work goes beyond recruitment? I'm thinking of like the remittance economy, right? A lot of folks don't understand there's a huge sort of, back and forth, right? There's certain countries where their GDPs, it's Lesotho or Tonga, whatever, that is remittances, right? Or you have, Filipino workers who are in the Middle East or in Hong Kong, sending money back home. How does that DEI work go beyond the recruiting? And then how does it sort of open up the doors to sort of looking at other, I wouldn't say issues, but opportunities out there for your employees to engage, even for the company to engage in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think unless you yourself experience remittances, or you're close, or you have family, right? Totally, same story. But I think a lot of folks actually don't even realize remittances is really a thing, right? Whereas it's such a huge part of the global economy. You mentioned the Philippines. So when we started the company 10 years ago, the first country we actually started with was the Philippines. And one of the reasons being is that as we learned about the remittances industry, you talk about GDPs of certain countries. When you think about the number of Filipinos who have, traveled all over the globe to be able to find meaningful work, to be able to send money home to their families, that amount of money that gets sent back constitutes over 10% of the Philippines GDP, which is very significant if you think about the small dollar amounts that a customer is sending on a regular basis every month home, and what that actually collectively means to the impact of the viability and health of a country, right? And so I think there's a much bigger, broader picture that we think about in terms of what the opportunities are of how a company like ours and others that are kind of in similar spaces, of the social impact that has on the financial health and wealth of countries that are especially located in the global south. And when you start to think about, we haven't touched upon it yet, but just thinking about the shifts that are happening because of, the environmental shifts that are happening because of climate change, global south is going to have the greatest impacts, negative impacts in terms of their ability to migrate, right? And so the investments of dollars that are being influxed into those countries will be ever so more critical to be able to create the resources and the infrastructure to be able to protect, citizens that live in those countries so that they can adjust to the changes that are happening around the globe.
Amazing. All right, we'll do one more question because it looks like I have some Q&A coming up, popping on my screen. This last question is for you, Neal, actually. So oftentimes when companies are able to engage in philanthropy, there's usually limited capacity. Can you kind of tell us how you make Tableau resources available to BIPOC-led organizations that have their own capacity limitations? And I know you mentioned this briefly in the beginning, but we'd like to have you delve deeper because you have so many great resources out there.
Great question. We have a couple of ways we do that. So last year, due to the pandemic, I was grateful that our senior leadership approved a few extra $1 million that we could have in our budget to support organizations around the world and many here in the Seattle region. And that included a $2 million round of grant making we did last year to a number of organizations working on education equity here in Seattle. And we decided that instead of doing kind of the traditional grant process where you do like a letter of intent and then you pick some people and then they, send in a bigger application and then you blah, 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 do a bunch of work. We went through a process of talking to a lot of people in the community to figure out, who are the organizations that are working on this issue that need support. And we simply just called them up and said, we're giving you money. And,
That's the best call ever, right?
giving you financial support. And it was a great call to make. And it was important because they were all scrambling, right? So they weren't able to do their in-person fundraisers. They weren't able to do in-person courses or, whatever their work happened to be. They're scrambling, trying to figure out how do they adapt to this new normal. And sorry, it's my dad calling for wine time.
Oh, wine time, love it.
He's 89. He calls every day at 3:30,
so sweet.
wanting to have wine. So we decided to make the process super simple, and we focused on the best we could on finding and supporting BIPOC-led organizations. One thing we noticed that I think is being solved now, this is last year, is that there was no way to find BIPOC-led organizations easily. So I literally spent like 2 weeks, I guess it was, finding organizations that are, obviously there are many that I knew that were BIPOC-led, but I wanted to also find ones that I hadn't heard about. And so I was networking with people, looking at websites, looking at staff lists on websites. And so there are activities going on both at kind of a local and a national level now, trying to help identify who are the BIPOC-led nonprofit organizations in communities, what do they do, and how can you actually find them easily, which is I'm excited about. This year, what we decided to do was invest in the Seattle Foundation Fund for Inclusive Recovery. And I have a small team, I only have 3 direct reports. And so it would be challenging for us to add a dozen or 2 dozen new grantees into our portfolio that were all, kind of local BIPOC-led organizations, because it's just from a capacity, it's hard to successfully manage that many relationships. And so we leveraged our partnership with the Seattle Foundation to reach more organizations than we could reach if we were doing it ourselves. And I'm excited about that particular approach. And then what we've learned is we have to put a ton of effort into networking. And our natural networks were not necessarily connected to BIPOC-led organizations. And so we actually have in our objectives this year for my entire team, we actually have numeric goals for how many BIPOC-led organizations and foundations that we have to get to know this year, so that across my entire team, we dramatically expand our network so that we can be more attuned to what the needs are and get more referrals and connections to organizations that we should be supporting.
That's wonderful. Meeting people where they are, really the grassroots, hearing from the community.
Yeah.
We're going to switch to Q&A. I've got a few questions lingering here in the chat. So I'll read the first one. I'll let the two of you decide who wants to take this first one. So a question from the audience. How do you respond to white employees who are defensive when asked to consider how they have benefited from their privilege under a culture of white supremacy? Not an easy one, but yes, a very important question. Very important.
Yeah, I feel like this type of conversation and dialogue always is, it's an ongoing conversation, right? It's not one that you have one time, and it's also part of kind of like finding the ways in which like an individual is ready to have the conversation. Obviously, I think if and thinking about context and environment, right? Is this a conversation that's happening in a large group versus a conversation that's happening one-on-one, right? Like creating the right environment to be able to have like a really constructive conversation, right? And then also creating a framework within the organization that allows for those kinds of conversations to occur, to be exploratory and to learn. One of the practices that we have at our organization with all of our DEI conversations is I always start out prefacing at the beginning at every single one of our DEI routines that we have and conversations we have, also the ad hoc ones that we'll do, is always start out with ground rules, right? Ground rules that say like, this is a space for learning without judgment. We're not here to, like judge people's experiences, but really to learn from them. And that's always the hardest one. Like I'll always get feedback from our teammates that go, it was really hard for me not to like say something, right? But to just listen and hear it because it was a difference of like a different experience, and really recognizing that. I think one of the hardest things is the acknowledgement that two truths can sit and exist in a space at the same time, right? And one isn't right or wrong or better or good than the other. They just are. And how do we find like that middle ground? And so much of the work that we've done in terms of really trying to understand like, how do we take those defenses down is really skilling and tooling our employees to be able to be in spaces where that acknowledgement exists. Because when there is shared agreement around how we're going to have a dialogue and conversation, it makes a really difficult conversation slightly less like tenuous, right? They're always going to be really difficult. These are not easy conversations to have, right? Yeah. But having some like framework or space in terms of like, what are the rules of engagement really help you take that tension down to be able to, and the defenses down to be able to really have a conversation.
I really like that, having the guardrails in place, sort of an understanding right there. Wow. Okay. Next question I have on here. So as one of the few BIPOC staff in a predominantly white institution, what would your recommendation be for how to balance between bringing DEI awareness to white colleagues and having to constantly be their teachers?
Also another hard one.
Yeah.
Kim, I'm gonna let Kim take that one. I might, if it's okay, make just one quick comment on the last question.
Yeah.
I think as a middle-aged white man, certainly I've been through that process many times where I've taken a diversity training, and part of the outcome of the training was, I have to admit to myself I have privilege. I think it's important to, I think everything Kim said is right on, and I think it's important that getting that white person to admit that they have privilege is not the end, it's the beginning. And you have to provide context, like what does that mean and why is that an important discovery? And then how does that discovery reflect, how do you reflect on that discovery as you do this journey, go through this journey that that we all have to go through. As a white guy doing this work, I'm 90% of the time I'm uncomfortable doing the work I'm doing on racial justice, talking to the people I'm talking to. I'm constantly afraid I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I'll put something out on Twitter or LinkedIn and I'll get eviscerated by somebody for, putting two words in the wrong order. So doing this work, I've just decided I'm going to screw up all the time, and that I'm just going to have to learn from it. And I think if people are getting defensive, I think for me, part of that's just part of the process, and you have to let them, it's okay if they feel defensive, and you have to let them move through that. But also if they're feeling defensive, part of me thinks that they're not yet fully understanding what that actually means and how that translates into what they have to think about as they do their job. And so I think it's important that it's a journey, and we have to help people just continually learn what it actually means for them.
I admit, I also feel uncomfortable too, right? As a person of color, as a member of the LGBTQ community, as a son of refugees, we're all going to feel uncomfortable in certain places, right? And but being able to admit that too is so important as well.
100%.
So that second question, oh my gosh, I find myself having to be a teacher as well, but I don't know, Kim, perhaps you have some more insight in this, but how do you balance that, right? Bringing in the awareness, but also constantly being a teacher. I know I've been put in places where I have to speak for other groups that I don't represent, and I feel uncomfortable. And so that's a very fine balance right there.
For sure. I think I think there's some variations in this too, wherein like, for instance, for myself, where it is my job to be that representative, right? Like it is my job to bring the awareness there, right? Versus an individual who's there who that actually isn't your job. You're just there to be an engineer or be a marketer, right? And you just happen to be a person of color or someone who identifies as LGBTQIA, right? Like you're just there trying to do your job, and yet you feel that burden, right, of having to be the teacher. I think that in those moments of, I feel that a lot of times for individuals who find yourself in that environment, to have some room to say on days where you're like, I feel motivated to like take on this role, but also that you have the permission, that you give yourself the permission to be like, not today, right? And that's totally okay, right? And it's not about you holding the feelings for those teammates, that your white teammates, to be like, why aren't you going to teach me? You don't owe that to them, right? And so it's like, I think in those moments that you can choose when you want to engage in those situations, where you find that if you don't have that advocacy within your organization because there isn't a DEI, director or a leader within the organization that's really holding that, that's when it's really important to be able to have employee voice, like a collective employee voice that's really representing, because then you tap each other out, right? So you're not the only one that's always leading that voice, because I think there is power in that collective of being able to say like, hey, tap me out today, I need somebody else to tap in, to be able to kind of like continue to push the organization to be able to like move initiatives forward and really change culture. And that's another tactic that has been really helpful, I think, for a lot of organizations that may not be as diverse or just smaller, right? And don't have the resources or capacity to have a full-time DEI leader, right? And so how do you find other ways to be able to support each other while also, like challenging the organization to do better?
Totally. Also, I know that the sea.citi's folks have been working on building a consortium with all the other ERGs from other companies too, and I think that may be a good place to start building some of the affinity and sort of sharing of ideas, and basically a person to connect to, right, if you need to. So,
For sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Kim's right on, and I would say there are allies, so try to find the allies who can support you, and then also look outside, look to customers and stakeholders outside of the company who can also help. Both Tableau and Salesforce were heavily driven by customer feedback, and starting with George Floyd's murder last year, that we had a really active customer base who were asking us, what are you doing? And it wasn't just externally, what are we doing about the racial justice issues in the US, but it was like, what are you doing internally? What are you doing to support your employees? And that was coming from customers. And so I think that's oftentimes a powerful source of input and alignment that gets forgotten.
So crucial, yeah.
Yeah.
Neal, a question for you, actually. We applaud your low barrier grant making, but how do you think about and measure the impact of your grant making?
I've never been asked that question.
I know.
I'm totally kidding. So it's the one thing I always say is, I work in a data company, and it is uncomfortable working in a data company and having a hard time finding data that measures our impact. And the reason I say that is we are capacity builders. So, when we partner with a nonprofit like Feeding America or Community Solutions or Equal Opportunity Schools here in Seattle, we donate software, financial support, training. We help them build their Tableau data infrastructure and use that as part of their work. We don't think it's authentic for us to then say that we've helped X number of kids get into advanced placement programs in school, which is equal opportunities work. So we don't try to draw that thread from our work all the way to the end outcome for the community. And therefore we don't really have metrics that say, hey, yay, we helped 50,000 kids get into advanced placement programs, because we're not the ones doing that work. So we measure impact in a number of ways. We of course have this kind of fiduciary responsibility to make sure that the grant money is being used well, that the software is being used well, that that the assets that we're investing are actually being used well. So we have a whole bunch of metrics around that. And then we have some work with groups like Community Solutions, which works to end homelessness in the US, where we've set a collective goal to functionally end homelessness in 75 cities in the US by 2024, I think it is. And so we don't track a lot of the incremental steps there. We just say, are we on track to hit 75 cities by that end date? And that's the gauge that we watch the dial move on, is, are we on track to get to those 75 cities or not? And then everything else kind of in between that is quantitative. So, you know, we hear stories about how XYZ organization in city Y is using data to end homelessness. And so that's a story that we anchor on in terms of telling our stakeholders, our VPs and everybody and employees in the company. Those qualitative stories are the important stories that we have to tell to our stakeholders to keep them engaged and interested in our work. So it's a combination of both qualitative and quantitative data.
Wow. I feel a lot of nonprofits get that question as well, you know, and I think
they do. Yeah.
It's hard, you know. And we at CCs, we've been thinking about this as well, and sometimes that quantifying it's difficult. It's not as easy. I mean, we may not see it right away. It may be further down. It may manifest in different ways than we're traditionally used to seeing. So, yeah. All right. I'm getting a ping from Nick. He's like, next steps. So I think our time has run out, Luanda. Is that correct?
That's right. Thank you all so much. That was such a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate your ability to be honest and candid with us. And Stephen, I think your background was so great at facilitating and getting those questions to be relevant and connected. I really appreciate all of your time. Thank you all for joining. If you work for a sea.citi member and you have some extra time with our panelists, we're going to have a small group discussion. You should have received a link from me. We're going to log off this version of Zoom and log into a new version of Zoom, which we're all familiar. You know, we do that all day anyway. So one more time. And we'll see those of you there. For everyone else, you'll receive follow-up information and resources. And thank you for joining us again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.